This SE30 suffered from catastrophic battery failure, and in the last episode I stripped the original logic board of most of its components and transferred them over to a newly manufactured replica of the original circuit board. I got to a point where the machine could turn on and display something on the screen, but the picture was broken and garbled. So let's continue where we left off last time and see how it eventually got sorted out. Alright, so as I concluded in the last video, the problem seemed to be limited to the video interface. So I studied the SE30 schematics for a bit to figure out exactly which chips are involved with the video interface, and then I inspected those chips closely and noticed that a leg of one of the F253 multiplexers was actually not soldered and just sorta hung in the air. So I applied some new solder and then I tried to turn the machine on again, feeling hopeful that the problem would be solved this time. But no, still garbled. It was slightly better than before though. Now I could clearly make out the blinking question mark in the garbled mess. At this point, I couldn't find anything else that was visibly wrong, and I started to suspect that one of the chips must be bad. My first hunch was that one of the video RAM chips was bad, but I also made a post on the forums hoping to get some input, and a few hours later I got a suggestion from Bolly that it looked like a video RAM addressing issue and to try using new F253s. So I hit up Mouser and ordered some new chips. Once the new chips arrived, I desoldered the old ones, this time using Chip Quick desoldering alloy. The Chip Quick allowed me to get the old chips off without using too much heat, which could have damaged the nearby electrolytic capacitor. So then I soldered in the new chips and tried powering the board up again. And it's alive. Yep, the new F253s did it. Man, was I happy to see that stupid little floppy icon. Alright then, now I could finally move on and complete the board with the rest of the components and connectors. All that's left now is the metal support bar that goes over the row of connectors. I desoldered it from the old board using a combination of the solder braid, hot air and the soldering gun. There's a lot of solder on both sides of the board and plenty of metal that leads the heat away, so I cranked both the hot air and the iron up to their maximum temperature settings for this. The bar had developed a bit of rust from the battery goop, so once I had desoldered it, I went over it a bit with a Dremel before installing it on the new board. And that was pretty much it. The new logic board was now done. Here's how it looks completed. Most components from the old board were salvageable, and the ones that weren't were easy enough to find replacements for, except one, the RTC chip. This chip is responsible for PRAM and the real-time clock, and it sits right next to the battery, and on my specimen all 4 pins on one side had been eaten away by corrosion. Unfortunately, this chip is also necessary for the machine to boot, so it needed to be repaired somehow or else replaced. I tried scraping off some of the plastic to see if I could solder on replacement legs, but it looked like the corrosion had eaten its way all the way to the core of the chip, so this turned out to be a dead end. I've seen on the forums that it might be possible to use an ATtiny85 microcontroller in place of the custom Apple chip. Apparently someone wrote a firmware for that, but I haven't been able to confirm if it works for the SE30, and I weren't able to get an ATtiny85 either, as they seem to be out of stock everywhere. But fortunately, I happen to have a Macintosh SE with an intact logic board at my disposal, and the SE uses the same chip, so I shamelessly robbed it of its RTC and put it in the new SE30 board. Hopefully I can get my hands on an ATtiny85 soon and try that RTC firmware and end up with both machines working. Anyway, all that was left to do now was to fix up the case. Well, actually there was one other issue too, but we'll get to that in a bit. metal chassis had a pretty big rusty patch close to where the battery sits, so I went over it with a Dremel steel brush to get the loose rusty flakes off. Then I applied some rust converter and let it sit for a few hours. Once the rust converter had done its thing, I applied a coating of silver metal paint. The result isn't perfect, but way better than a huge rusty patch at least. I also gave the floppy drive some much needed attention and applied new grease to the drive shaft and eject mechanisms. The exterior of the case was in pretty good shape and not terribly yellowed. It was kinda dirty though, so I wiped it off with some soapy water, but I didn't feel it necessary to retrobrite it. And once that was done, it was finally time for reassembly. The original hard drive was not in great shape, so I used an 80 meg SCSI drive that I had lying around instead. I've also ordered a blue SCSI that I'll probably use with this machine in the future, but for now, this'll do. Then I installed System 7.1 from floppies, and once that was up and running, I needed to get some software onto the machine. So I hooked it up to a PowerBook G3 over serial. Using AppleTalk over serial from a newer machine is a pretty simple way to get software over to these older Macs, and newer versions of macOS can generally connect to all older versions. And this is where I ran into another issue. The SE30 refused to show up in the chooser. Okay, after fiddling around with the settings for a bit and not being able to make it work, I came to the conclusion that there must be a problem with the serial ports. So I figured it was time to run some diagnostics and see if it would show any problems. So I got another floppy drive equipped Mac out of storage and made a boot floppy for Snooper, which is a diagnostics utility for old Macs. Snooper can run a battery of tests that verifies different parts of the hardware. Most of those tests can run just by themselves, but in order to test the serial ports, you need special loopback plugs that basically connects the serial port to itself, allowing Snooper to test communication over that port. The original retail version of Snooper included two such plugs, but nowadays you need to make them yourself if you want to run those tests. One way is to cut the plugs of a serial cable and then connect some wires together, but I didn't want to sacrifice a cable just for this, so instead I took one of the serial ports from the old logic board and connected some of its legs together. I then put a piece of heat shrink tubing over it as protection. It's not pretty, but it works and it can turn any serial cable into a loopback plug for Snooper testing. So then I ran Snooper with my makeshift loopback plug connected, and as expected, the serial port tests failed. I tested both ports and they both returned bad. On the bright side though, everything else seemed to be good, so that's something. Anyway, I wasn't really sure which chips are involved with the serial ports, so I hit up the schematics again. Okay, so the serial ports are controlled by UG12, which is an 8530 serial controller. But since Snooper seemed to be able to at least issue commands to the serial ports, I figured that the controller itself is probably fine. So I turned my attention to these chips here instead. These are line drivers that are used for transmitting and receiving signals over the serial cables. And a closer look at these chips on the logic board revealed that UD12 did in fact have some bad solder joints. Pin 2, 19 and 18 lacked continuity with the board, which would certainly explain why the serial ports didn't work. Apparently, I failed to properly inspect this one during assembly. Well, alright then, so I added some new solder to those pins, and this time I made sure that they had proper continuity with their pads. So then I booted Snooper and ran the serial port tests again, and this time they reported that the ports were okay. Nice. Now that the serial ports were okay, I could finally get some software onto the machine. So I hooked up the PowerBook again and went over to macintoshgarden.org to download the stuff I wanted, and then I simply sent it over to the SE30 over AppleTalk.
Note of the task maker.
So there you have it. This SE30 went from completely dead from catastrophic battery failure to fully working with a brand new logic board. Well, brand new PCB anyway, and some new chips and connectors. So in the end, was it really worth all the time and trouble it took to get here? Well, I mean, it depends on how you look at it, I guess. It would definitely have been easier to just find a mostly working SE30 and do a recap or some minor repairs, and it might even have been cheaper too. I ended up ordering parts several times because I didn't bother to figure out exactly what I needed ahead of time, which of course added some unnecessary shipping fees and stuff, but regardless of that, I could probably have found a fully working SE30 for the same amount or less of what I spent here. And when you factor in the time it took to do this, well, then it becomes pretty clear that it's not really worth it if all you want is just a working SE30. But for me, this kind of tinkering is exactly why I'm interested in vintage computers in the first place. So a project like this is more about the journey rather than the goal. It's been super fun, and I've probably leveled up my soldering skills by a few notches in the process too. It's also incredibly satisfying in the end when you finally manage to get the thing working. So for me, the answer is yes, it was totally worth it. I might even do it again at some point. But that's pretty much it for now. If you like this video, then perhaps you'll like some of my other stuff too, so have a look around and maybe click that subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching, take care, and see you next time.